by way of icebreaker, and in case I need to know who you are later on. I learned that trick at last year's IMCC conference in St. John's, and it's a nice habit to develop. Right, so my name's Simon Oliver. I was going to present something far more extensive, but apparently I'm on a really tight schedule, and my boss at the back will tell me when I need to move forward. So I thought I'd present something new, the data that we're working on at the moment. So this is a paper that we currently have in review with biological conservation. It's called Risk and Resilience, High Stakes for Sharks Making Transjurisdictional Crossings to Use a Conservation Area. It's a grassroots conservation area in the Philippines that David nicely introduced us to previously. So this is in collaboration with a number of colleagues from different universities in the US and the UK. I'm not going to dwell on this very long because I think we've had enough information about it already, but you can check us out online. Thresher Shark Research and Conservation Project, I founded it in 2007. It's a not-for-profit that has been the joy of my life in a lot of ways. It's been a really meaningful enterprise, and it's one of those where, yeah, we'll just never give it up. But we take a lot of volunteers, such as the students from SMU, who come out to help us gather data and do something about hanging on to my baby, pelagic thresher sharks. And I start by saying pelagic thresher sharks because, of course, pelagic means oceanic, and the concept of oceanic sharks is really important to the story that I'd like to tell you about today. So these are, of course, by virtue of being oceanic sharks, K-select species. They mature very late. Females are between 10 and 14 before they can reproduce. Males between 7 and 10. They produce 2 offspring of a 1-to-1 sex ratio, so a very nice little evolutionary trait in terms of sustainability. If you don't apply fisheries pressures, of course these animals don't have that mechanism built in to deal with external pressure. So, as I said, oceanic, K-select species that, as a consequence, as with all oceanic species, we understand and we think that they're highly vulnerable to exploitation simply by virtue of the fact that if you look at their life strategies in terms of their reproductive rates and cycles, that's a very, very nice sort of stable strategy, but when you start applying fisheries pressure, there was a study by Baum et al. In 1999 from the Atlantic where they found that 75% of common thresher sharks have disappeared in the last 2 decades, and there's speculation that this is true across the other 2 species. So these are animals that are well prized for fisheries. They represent 12% of Taiwan's annual shark catch, for example. That figure has now gone up. So we now know that from monitoring only 2 fish markets in Taiwan, that over 6,000 individuals are caught per annum. That's I stole this slide from a few years ago, sorry for that. They're prized by anglers because they put up a really good fight, and that is also important in our study, or what I'm about to show you, because it relates to how we can go about tagging them and understanding their movement patterns. It's long been speculated that these animals hunt with their tails, so they've got this elongate side-like tail that's roughly equal in length to the body. And why would evolution come up with such a unique piece of morphology in shark taxa? So it's long been suspected that they use their tails for hunting, and in 2010 we got really, really lucky, and some friends of mine found that they actually do this in the wild, so we set up a really nice little simple experiment to show that this is a very effective way of hunting schooling fish, which appears to be their preferred prey. Here we're looking at the distribution of pelagic thresher sharks in Southeast Asia, and this is where the story starts to pick up a little bit. So we know from fisheries data that we've got a population in Taiwan. We know also from fisheries data that we've got another population in Indonesia. And we know that these two populations are phylogeographically isolated, and that's a very important element. So looking at the Philippines, our field station is here in northern Cebu, and we know that we've got a population in and around Luzon, in Tubataha, around Mindanao. And a key question for us, which is sort of driving our current research, is whether the extent to which these populations are mixing. And the reason for that is we're starting to see on our site individuals with bent dorsal fins, bent pectoral fins that, as from the outside, without doing the genetic work, is sort of indicative of deleterious mutations that might be indicative of inbreeding depression. So that's a very important question for us at the moment. Our study site is based on Malapascua, which is a tiny little island in the central Visayas of the Philippines. Has anyone been there? A couple of you, right? So a nice little spot where a nearby shallow water seamount called Monad Shoal attracts these sharks, which generates a very significant amount of income for the local economy. So we estimate that it's approximately 80% of the island, and with more knock-on effects in the region. The ecological significance so this is a shallow coastal seamount, and the ecological significance of seamounts attracting sharks and rays is fairly poorly understood. It's been suggested that some shark species, for example hammerheads, use geomagnetic fields in the Earth's crust to navigate to and from these sites where they refuge socially and forage. More recently, some of our work looked at cleaning ecology. So we're starting to understand that these sites also function as cleaning stations, which service a variety of elasmid ranks, not just pelagic thresher sharks. But in our case, we've got these two players. We've got Will Smith from Shark Tale. Yeah. Labroides dimijatus in the car wash. And this guy, the crescent wrasse. And we're starting to gain more and more understanding of this. And so this is a whole dynamic that I could go on about for years. It's very, very interesting. It's a very sort of cosmopolitan system. And it's a classic example of cooperative behavior among species. It's very, very well studied, but I'll give that talk another day. So we know that they come here to clean, and then recently, I guess a couple of years ago, we had somebody who was on the project who took this photograph, and then he was a professional photographer from Australia, and this is actually back in the days of Hans Haas kind of thing. He'd been around, he worked with Ron and Valerie Taylor, and he was just sifting through his images, and he was binning them, he was throwing them all out, and he saw this image, and he wasn't sure what it was, so he sent it to me, and I fell out of my chair. So this actually is really, really cool. It's the first, to the best of my knowledge, it's the first image of oceanic shark. Now I go back to that term, oceanic. It'll become relevant a little later. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first documentation of an oceanic shark giving birth or during parturition in the wild. And what's really interesting for me, so you remember our crescent wrasse, our moon wrasse, is somehow engaged in that process. And this is at a cleaning station on the same site. So now we've got our sharks cleaning. We know from our data collected by people like Jerry and Dave and colleagues from SMU, we know that we've got juveniles, transitionals, so big ones, small ones, medium ones, juveniles, transitionals, and adults. We know that we've got boys and girls, and we know that we've also got gravid females. So the image of this, initially we thought that we had a roller coaster of oceanic species that were just coming through to get cleaned. And now they're giving birth. We know we've got gravid females, and we've got this thing with these dorsal fins and pectoral fins that are somewhat indicative of something not being quite right in genetic variation. So we started asking questions about whether or not we're dealing with a metapopulation in isolation, or if these guys, if there's that question of mixing, or if they're hanging out here because all of the resources that they need are in place. So, Monad Scholl, going back to the idea that these animals generate a tremendous amount of income for the local economy, has over time become a grassroots conservation area. And about 2 years ago it was declared the first shark and ray sanctuary. There's great pride in the first in the region. And this is in a way it's a really nice story, because when I started working there things were far more hostile, but now people are speaking to each other. And this is stakeholders getting together and agreeing that we need to do something to protect this habitat. So the paperwork is in place, and more importantly, it's being enforced. So they've got maritime police, and this sort of stuff has really evolved over time. They're out there. In fact, I was just there last week, and they are really out there checking every boat, and that is such a great development. It was very hostile previously. So for this study, we had a few key questions that we wanted to understand. So we want to understand the population, site connectivity, and turnover. Are these animals residents? Or are they, as I said, a conveyor belt of oceanic species, of oceanic sharks that are coming in, stopping off, getting cleaned, and then going off somewhere else? Or are all the resources that they need in place for them to stay inside? We also wanted to look at site fidelity, so I don't have time to go into the intricacies of the mechanisms involved in cleaning ecology, but part of it is that you go to the same doctor, presumably. Yeah, no? Anybody go to a different doctor every time they feel sick? No? Right. So presumably the reason for that is because your doctor makes you feel better, and you can trust the next time that your doctor is going to make you feel better as well. Or you go to the same hairdresser, unless you're me, because your hairdresser makes you look beautiful as you do. So in cleaning ecology, there's a similar thing. We know that clients, so animals that go to get cleaned, have preferences for services that are provided for individual cleaners. So we wanted to look at site fidelity as part of that system, and the movement patterns. So as a measure of vulnerability. And here we're looking at the fine scale rather than long-term movement patterns. As a consequence of all that, unveil a little bit more about their ecology and their life history strategies. So to do this, normally in academia, those of us who work in academia will know that grant money is not always the easiest thing to get. So one of my colleagues who worked on this study, his return rate is something like 70%. Right? In the UK, that's not possible. The best grant writers score about 10%. So I thought, sod that. I've got all these TV people coming after me all the time. I'll convince them to give me money. So Discovery Channel took the bait, and we did something that some would say is akin to prostitution, and we sold ourselves for them to make this film called Ninja Sharks. And if any of you want to upgrade your sensibilities about sharks, have a look at it on YouTube. It was for Shark, what do they call that? Shark Week. Shark Week. Ninja Sharks. Anyway, the good news of that was they gave me an enormous amount of money, and I got to spend it in 6 weeks. That's really cool. Try and spend £500,000 in 6 weeks. That was great. So with that money, we got rebreathers, tags, boats, and all manner of stuff. And this is me putting a tag, which had a depth sensor and temperature sensors, as well as an ID code that broadcast at a very high rate on the first shark. And I think that was a happy day. There we go. So we followed on, we'd go out and deploy these tags using rebreathers. And then at the surface, we had our colleagues, so that's Tom from Rutgers University and my staff, and they would follow these sharks on an open skiff using stereo-directional hydrophones, and we just go and follow wherever they went. And we did this as long as we could. We also used the balance, so that's sort of oldish technology, except for the fact that we were using rebreathers. And the reason we did that, if we go back to the angling technique, so normally when you put tags on sharks, you long line them, you pull them out of the water, you stick a tag on, life is good. These guys generate, so they put up such a good fight, they generate a huge amount of adrenaline, and 50% of them that are landed dead. So essentially, if you're going to long line a shark to put a tag on it, with these guys, your attrition rate's 50% even before you get the tag on. So without being into killing sharks for data, it's not something that we do. Anyway, the advance on this was we had this really cool, really expensive at the time, and today I find out that it's absolute rubbish, but anyway, a sonar system. So we had our stereo-directional hydrophones, then we had this screen with our sonar system, our fish finder, which allowed us to follow our shark and hear it at the same time. And if you hear it, it is actually really cool. It makes that sort of sound. You feel like you're in some sci-fi movie. In the end, we tagged 14 ninja sharks in a month. And we gave them all ninja names because you can sell that, right? So Discovery loved this. Yeah, we had Chuck Norris, we had Cheech and Chong. Those of you of my generation might get that. Leroy. Scarlet was named after my daughter. That's the one that I was able to slide in there for non-sensational reasons. Anyway, of these, so of course with all this high-tech equipment, stuff goes wrong. And only of the 14 that we tagged, only 7 of them gave us continuous data points that we were able to use for rate of movement analysis. But that was enough for us to work some pretty important stuff out. So these guys, we quickly realized this is Monad Shoal, and these are some of the tracks that we followed. And what was really interesting was that they'd leave the shoal at about between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning, and all of them beelined north-northeast across to Leyte to this isobar and would split north or south and carry on from there. And it got so regular that we ended up calling it a shark highway. And I'd get out of the water after tagging a shark, and I wouldn't have to look for the chase boat. I'd know it was right there on the shark highway. And this sort of predictability is really, really interesting. What is concerning is that in that process, so this is Monad Shoal, that's Malapascua, this is the border between Cebu, so this is part of Cebu province and this is part of Leyte. And in the Philippines, provinces are very much like states in the US in that they're very autonomous politically. So right away what we have is every single morning these sharks are traveling across a border instantly where you've got a sort of a mixed economy in Cebu that is to a certain extent very dependent on the money that it earns from tourism. So in that sense, these sharks, as we saw from our grassroots conservation area, are somewhat protected. If you take a shark out on Malapascua, somebody's going to come after you. It's not a very sensible thing to do because they earn so much money there. But over here in Leyte is an agrarian state, and fisheries comprise a very significant amount of part of the economy, and they're fished there. So there's a very big Thresher Shark fishery down in Sogod over here. So right away, our sharks are putting themselves at risk every single day, and it's highly predictable as well. Along with that predictability, we found, so what we're looking at here, the blue lines are one shark and the red circles are another shark. And from depth sensors, we knew that there wasn't social connectivity in this sense. So one shark might be all the way at the bottom, and the other one might be 200 meters above. And it's quite clear that they weren't necessarily communicating, if sharks do that. They weren't connected, so we weren't able to associate this as social behavior, yet they were following exactly the same path. So that opens a whole range of really interesting questions, and sort of brings us back to this idea of the shark highway. When we looked at the data and our instantaneous rate of movement, which was around 4 kilometers an hour, we calculated that assuming that these sharks return to the seamount on a daily basis, that they had the potential to cross 5 different borders on a 24-hour cycle. So assuming they go out and forage, or do whatever they do, and then come back to the seamount, we knew this from our passive monitoring, which I'll show you in a second. This was the mean range. And the outliers are our standard deviations. So they had the potential to cross 5 different jurisdictional areas, and if you go and you work in conservation, that becomes a problem in a place like the Philippines, where the interest groups have a lot of strength and a lot of power. So we now know that we need to negotiate we need to bring all of these governors around the same table and negotiate some sort of parity amongst them if we're going to be able to do something to protect them. These are the vertical movements, and this is also really interesting. So we found that all day long, they would zoom out down the shark highway, and as they did that, they would use the entire water column to bob up and down. So we're talking 0 to 350 meters in this particular channel. And that this oscillation obviously correlated to temperature ranges. So at the surface, the water was about 32 degrees. At the bottom, it was probably around 12, something like that. Oh, 11, there we go. And we suspect that this oscillation behavior in conjunction or as a correlation with the temperature, that they're sort of doing a levee flight type foraging or engaging in a levee flight type foraging strategy, but also that they're thermoregulating at the same time. So sharks, contrary to what people think, one drop in a gazillion billion liters of water and the great white will come up and take a big bite out of your bottom or something, isn't quite true. So sharks generally have, they sense in a sort of a disc-like fashion. So as they scan the water for prey, they have to move up and down. So we associate this behavior with foraging. We also, in conjunction with our horizontal movements, we also monitored, we did this thing called passive monitoring, where we deployed some data loggers that were, the batteries I think lasted for about 3.5 months, and we put them at the cleaning stations on the seamount where we knew that these sharks would return on a regular basis. And here we're starting to look and try and understand if they're, again, resident or highly migratory. And this showed us that every shark that we tagged returned to that site. And the temporal distribution of the data showed that for the most part they returned at around midnight, would hang out there all night. Don't ask me what they were doing there, I don't know. That's the next question. But in the morning they were cleaning and they would go off and forage. And this is fairly consistent across all of the individuals that we tagged. We also found, and this for me is a really interesting part of the story because of the whole cleaning ecology thing, we also found that some sharks showed very, very clear preferences for some stations, to the extent that some sharks would only visit one station, while others would sort of select services from different stations, so getting different haircuts in different places. But the idea behind this is that they had personalities, and sharks do have personality. We know this from studies on lemon sharks elsewhere. So, what implications does all this have for conservation? Well, first of all, the idea that they cross up to 5 different borders, assuming that they return to the seamount, is obvious. We need to negotiate conservation across different interest groups, and it's not just in government, it's also out there in the field, in communities, and that can be a very, very difficult task. Secondly, by virtue of using the entire water column, so by bobbing up and down from zero to the bottom, normally you can regulate fisheries by controlling tackle, by controlling fishing gear. So you can say your hooks can only be of this size, your nets have to have certain mechanisms to allow some animals to get through or not to capture others, but you can also regulate the depth of your long lines. But if these animals are using the entire water column, then that becomes an issue. We can't just regulate fisheries tackle to try and protect them. And of course, understanding, as with anything, understanding their behavior and how they use their habitat is vital if we're going to use the current approach, which is, of course, to protect habitat, and by virtue of doing that, protect the species. Oh, Pam, look at that, I'm bang on time. Lots of people involved in this work. As with anything, you can't do it with a whole team. So lots of people to thank, but particularly people from Scuba Zoo, Evolution, you guys. Yeah, there you go, that's my story for today.
So if any of you have any questions, we have